Well, the Israeli government has been charged, disgracefully in my opinion, with genocide by the government of South Africa, who took this ludicrous accusation to the so-called International Court of Justice, the ICJ. On Friday, the ICJ announced their findings, which was a bit of a mixed bag, including demanding that Israel make sure that genocide doesn't occur in Gaza, which is a bit like the old, when did you stop beating your wife? But what's really going on here is far more sinister than what it at first appears. Dr. Frans Cronje is the former CEO of South Africa's Institute of Race Relations. He joins us now. Dr. Cronje, thank you so much for coming on. You have drawn a terrifying comparison between Hamas, the butchers responsible for the atrocities of October 7th, the murders, the rapes, the mutilations, the kidnappings, and so on, and the government of South Africa with their claims against Israel. You accuse South Africa of being the plaything of the Ayatollahs in their declared goal of wiping Israel off the map. So let's get to the basics. Before we discuss the ICJ findings of the other day, tell me, Dr. Cronje, why did members of the South African government head straight to Tehran days after October 7th?
Well, there's a bit of a history here, and I think from the history we can get into what's going on in the present. The history is the South African government is incredibly corrupt, and over the past 25 years, it hasn't been averse to taking money from corrupt regimes and then offering diplomatic support for them on global fora. That goes all the way back to the Suharto regime in Indonesia, where South Africa's ruling party is alleged to have taken $50 million. They did a similar thing with the corrupt Abacha regime, which was absolutely a brutal, corrupt, autocratic, and bloodthirsty. Money was taken from Saddam Hussein before the Iraq war, and in exchange South Africa soft-soaped the Iraqis and were very critical of that war, provided a lot of defense on global fora. With Gaddafi, the same thing happened again. So this isn't new to people who are informed and have watched the behavior of the South African government, and particularly of its ruling party. In the present, two things are happening. The South African strategy is twofold. As you know, as your viewers know, Iran uses proxies to prosecute its war against Israel and against the West beyond Israel. And you get armed proxies such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the like. They fight with guns and bombs and sort of traditional military means. But the Iranians understand that Israel is too strong diplomatically, financially, economically, and militarily to be summarily overrun. And so there's another front to the Iranian war against the West, and that's the diplomatic front. And it's here where South Africa comes in. It does have the history, the country, of apartheid and the victory against that and the rise of the formal democracy in 1994. And while that's partly tarnished, given the corruption that has came along with liberation, the position of the country as a bastion of the idea of human liberty and civil rights still lives on to a certain extent. The South Africans are aiding the Iranians in two ways. The first is to poison in the West the idea of Israel, an opinion against Israel. And the very specific desire there is to so poison Western opinion that particularly the US Congress in the fullness of time starts to make support for Israel, and particularly military support, conditional to a point that it hems in the ability of Israel's battlefield commanders to fend off the ring of fire of the armed Iranian proxies that surround that country. The second objective for the South Africans is to so stigmatize young Jews around the world that service in the IDF becomes increasingly controversial and very, very difficult. And if the South Africans can aid the Iranians in in achieving both objectives to any extent at this roughly the same time. You cut off a lot of the external aid for Israel. You fracture domestic consensus within Israel amongst young Israelis about service in the IDF, and you then greatly raise the vulnerability of Israel either to future armed incursions or to being forced into a series of negotiated settlements that will piece by piece dismember, disable, and eventually destroy the Jewish state. Rowan.
You draw parallels, Dr. Cronje, with the genocide and apartheid claims against Israel by South Africa and in the World Fora. You draw parallels between that and the way America lost the war in Vietnam. Can you briefly explain that, Dr. Cronje?
Yeah, I think for any Westerner who's grown up in the post-Cold War world, I think a weakness in the West is the idea that the Cold War was won. And if you're a young political leader today in the West, or think tank leader, or policymaker, or national security person, you've probably grown up in an environment where you do not have living memory experience of ideological warfare and how powerful that can be in giving a less well-armed, less well-equipped terror organization, for example, the ability to challenge a much better equipped, much wealthier, much more prosperous, much more technologically advanced adversary. Now, towards the final stages of the Vietnam War, and the Vietnamese were very good at this stuff. They were backed by the East Germans, obviously, and the Soviets, who at the time were the masters of the art. And South Africa's then liberation movements, or the centerpiece of that, was the African National Congress, the party that still governs South Africa today. They went to visit the Vietnamese, and particularly General Giap, still in the tunnels in Vietnam. And they learned a great deal about ideological warfare from there, and then later themselves from the East Germans and the Soviets. And I think the comment that a lot of Western observers of this current conflict in Gaza need to have in mind is the lament that the Supreme Commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam later agreed with, General Westmoreland, that the Americans lost the war there, not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but on the streets of Washington and in the living rooms of America. And I think there's a risk within Israel, within its security establishment. I think it's a risk that exists, and vulnerability amongst Western national security thinkers broadly, that their unrivaled economic and technological and military superiority keeps them safe. And what they're going to learn out of this ICJ case that's just passed and related efforts on the part of the South Africans is that if your defensive strategies, if your deterrence ability to head off ideological attacks and diplomatic attacks on the scale of what the South Africans launched, I mean, what the South Africans launched was the diplomatic version of October the 7th. If you cannot fend off those kinds of attacks effectively, in the fullness of time, your technological and traditional military advantages will be eroded to a point that you become very vulnerable to threats posed by autocratic societies or terror groups such as Hamas.
And just very, very briefly, Dr. Cronje, we're seeing these protests in Australia, around the Western world, exactly as happened in Vietnam, so I think your analogy is very valid. Just very quickly, in 30 seconds, your opinion on what happens now that the ICJ has made this kind of half-baked ruling.
Well, I think it's perverse. You know, the ICJ is bought into the South African thesis to a far too deep an extent, and the kind of messaging that you do need out of the Western world is to thank the Israelis and thank the brave soldiers of the IDF and thank their family members, because what they're doing in Gaza today and in other parts of the Middle East is heading off a very dangerous threat to the Western world broadly. And if that fight can't be won in Gaza, if it can't be won in the frontline states around Israel, in the fullness of time, you, your family, and your kids in Western capitals are going to face the consequences of that. So, yeah, hopefully Western democracies learn to see through this. learn to see through the fact that the UN as an institution is dominated by non-liberal democratic states. They shouldn't be ceding any moral authority to that institution or any panel or subcommittee, the ICJ included, that is linked or tied to it or falls underneath.
Dr. Frans Cronje, thank you so much for coming on Outsiders this morning with these wise words and warnings. Stay safe. Thank you very much, Dr. Frans Cronje.